Sukkot. Quick question. Back when his children's home. Odessa. Well, he said that's it that I had, but there's a link. The first doesn't go through. I'm good, yeah. Good? Yeah. You all covered? Well, I'm good. He'll send me the link. Oh, yeah. I have a charitable trust. I have it with Fidelity. Costs nothing to open it. Oh, right. Whatever money you want in, and that's your charitable deduction. So 2,000 or 1,000, and then throughout the year, you just
Make donations.
And it's not a charitable donation. You've already deducted it. So much when you funded it. Good morning. Everyone's happy. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
You saved a glass of wine for me. Sure. Thank you.
No, all right, thank you. Thanks for suggesting that. Here we go. What about? What about?
This is what I got from Peter Selborn. I don't know if it's any good. I wanted some dates on it, you know?
It doesn't have any. They only give you more room. What is your name?
David Coleman.
Okay, I'm Bobby. Okay. And you enjoy it? Where are you from originally? London. Sorry. And how long have you been in the States?
2 years.
Have they been here? Mostly here? Houston.
Yeah, I think it ends at noon. I stay the whole time. I'll get to noon at the front when I drop you off. Okay? Enjoy. Thank you.
I didn't think this was a great hit because
You really don't know. I mean,
I said, okay, where are we today? Well, I don't know.
you have to know where you were yesterday before you know where you are.
Yeah,
He used to give you the date, the portion.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's online, but I didn't do that.
I didn't know that.
I asked Peter for that, to send us his
Thank you for
copy
sharing.
of his.
Hey, how you doing? You made it.
I'll put something for you.
Okay.
The four sons of Pesach
Yeah.
can be equated to the four species of Sukkot.
Okay. Very nice.
But I'll tell you how.
Okay.
Do you watch series? Yeah. these like Netflix.
Yeah.
There's a series we saw called Small Light.
Called what?
The Small Light.
Oh yeah, someone else mentioned that.
It was unbelievable. It's about the resistance in Amsterdam, and it focuses on the Frank family. Now,
Oh yeah, I saw it.
oh, you
I
saw
saw
it?
it. Yeah. The Mipki's story.
Yeah,
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah,
I
it's
thought
wonderful.
it was so well done.
It was on National Geographic or something. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I saw the whole thing. So I knew it. Okay, here we go. Good Shabbos, everyone. Chag Sameach. It's Sukkot, so here we go. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledoratam berit olam V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledoratam berit olam Beini uven v'nei Yisrael oti leolam oti leolam v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledoratam berit olam Ki sheshet Asa Adonai et ha-shamayim et ha'aretz v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledoratam berit olam Ubayom hashvi shavat v'nafash Shabbat v'nafash Shabbat v'nafash v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledoratam berit olam Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Amen L'chaim. Okay, a blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kishana b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, good Shabbos, everyone. This is going to be a different kind of class than we usually do. First of all, because it's Sukkot, there's no Torah portion, and we're only dealing with the reading for Sukkot, which we'll do in the service after this, our festival service. We will read from Leviticus 23, which is the Torah portion of Emor, which mentions all of the different holidays, and we'll read the part having to do with Sukkot. But instead of talking about that, what I wanted to talk about was Sukkot, the historical nature of Sukkot in ancient Jewish history, which means to say the Tanakh and the Talmud. So what was Sukkot? What was Sukkot in the Tanakh? What was Sukkot in Talmudic times? And what were the really three occasions where there were famous festivals of Sukkot in which we learn a lot? And if you can look at these three historical occasions, then you can really figure out what Sukkot is supposed to be all about. So we're not going to use the Torah at all today. We're only going to look at Tanakh, which means to say all you need is the sheet that I handed out. But there are 3 sections, and I only brought verses on one of them. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to explain the first section and the third section, and then when we get to the second section, we can look at some of the sources, which I don't want to give anything away, but you can tell which part of the Tanakh they're from by looking at it, and then you'll know exactly what time frame we're dealing with. But what you might not recognize right away, unless you really, really know Tanakh, is the particular import of that specific period. So, a little bit of background a little bit of Torah midrashic background before we jump into the historical nature of Sukkot. When Abraham comes to sacrifice Isaac, God tells him, go to the land that I will show you, and go to the mountain that I'll show you, which ultimately becomes Mount Zion. And at that time, what is the name of that area called? More specifically, that area where the mountain is? Salem. It's called Salem, or in Hebrew, Shalem. And there's a king there named Melchizedek. Melchizedek, king of Salem. Not Oregon. Not Massachusetts, no witches. Well, maybe some witches, but different ones. The area is called Salem. And Abraham, so that's in the Torah. We know that from the Torah. Melchizedek, king of Salem, he comes out, he offers Abraham some bread. He had like a charcuterie without the ham, prepared for Abraham when he showed up, right? Some bread and water. And Abraham has some food with him. And then he goes up to the mountain and he's going to sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham says, this place should be called the place in which you see God. And the place in which a person would see someone is called Yira'eh. And that's what this place should be called. And that's what Abraham says to God. And God said, I can't. I already have a name for this place. It's called Salem, or in Hebrew, Shalem. But when the angel comes to Abraham and says, don't kill Isaac, kill the ram instead, and Abraham has a moment there, God says, all right, fine. You want to call it Yira'eh? No problem. But I'm not just kicking out Melchizedek. He believes in one God. So we're not getting rid of the Shalem, but I'll combine it. I'll take Yir'eh, and his Shalem, and we'll call this place Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. Right? So people often translate Jerusalem as city of peace, Ir Shalem, which is not correct. Yerushalayim doesn't, it sounds like the Hebrew word for city in Hebrew is Ir, and Yerushalayim, Yeru sounds like Ir, and Shalayim sounds like Shalom, but that's a coincidence. It really comes from the word Yira'eh, which means to see. This is the place where you can be seen by God, and it's also Shalem, this place of wholeness. And then we have the name Yerushalayim. That's in the Talmud, that story, in a tractate called Yoma, the one that deals with Yom Kippur. In any event, there's a story that when Abraham got there, he found by the base of the mountain a sukkah. And who built the sukkah? God. Now, why would God want to build a sukkah at the base of the mountain in Jerusalem where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac? So what is a sukkah?
Place to eat.
Okay. Got hungry? It's a shelter. It's a reminder. But is it, what's the nature of it? You stay in a sukkah all year?
Temporary.
It's temporary. So, when we were building these buildings, and they weren't ready yet, we had trailers where we put the kids for classes. They were temporary. When we gave tours and said, these temporary trailers are going to be here forever. This is what it's going to be. Now give me $100,000. That wouldn't have worked. Right? You have to say there's going to be that. That's just a wall, but I'm saying there's going to be big buildings, and there are now. It's going to be grand. So God had a sukkah, a temporary dwelling for himself by the base of the mountain. Why? Because he was waiting for the time when his home up on top of the mountain, the Holy Temple, was going to be built. He's waiting. God was waiting and praying that things would go the right way, that the Jews would come to the land of Israel and build the Holy Temple. Okay, clear so far? So already, from the very beginning of Abraham's first journey to Israel to the Temple Mount, we're drawing in our tradition a connection between Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot, and the things that go along with Sukkot, and the Temple Mount. You see the connection? Okay. Now, you might say, big deal, that doesn't sound that great, but when you see the rest of what I'm going to show you, you're going to say, wow, that's pretty amazing. Okay, so first point I want to make is right off the bat, in our tradition, there is this idea that God built a sukkah for himself, waiting for something called Geula. Geula. Geula means redemption. In fact, I think I've told you about the African American descendants in Charleston who call themselves Gullah Gullah, the Gullah Gullah tour. You can go on the tour and take it. And they got that word potentially from the Hebrew. The Gullah Gullah or the Geula, right? They knew the Bible pretty well.
I just wanted to ask about, that wasn't where Jerusalem finally ended up.
I'm sorry?
That spot is not where Jerusalem finally ended up.
By the time you go
Sure. So the question was, that's not where they finally ended up. Where did Abraham take Isaac to be sacrificed? The Temple Mount. The rock that's under the dome of the rock. That's exactly where they built the Holy Temple. That's Mount Zion. That's where he went. So, I mean, that's the tradition in the Torah is Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac on the altar, which was the rock that was there at the time. Isaac was the prototypical offering from which every other offering in the Holy Temple on the altar would be. Which is why, by the way, when Abraham, when there was a famine, Abraham left and went down to Egypt. And then when there was a famine in Isaac's time, Isaac went down to Egypt. And what happened when he got to the border? God said, you can't leave. You've got to stay in the land of Israel. Why? Because if you have a sacrifice that's dedicated for the altar, it's not allowed to leave the land of Israel. So if you've said, this sheep I'm going to offer on the temple, I'm going to offer in the holy temple, and then that sheep wanders across the border into Jordan, you can no longer bring it. The animals, once they're sacrificed, so that's why Isaac couldn't leave.
So that could be the whole reason that God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, because he didn't want the descendants to leave the land of Israel. Because I never understood why.
No, because the descendants had to leave Israel. If the descendants didn't leave Israel, you couldn't have Egypt. You couldn't have the Exodus. You couldn't have the whole story. So that wouldn't work, because you had to have the whole story of the Exodus. Isaac himself couldn't leave. Jacob had to leave. Because if Jacob didn't leave, and Joseph, if they didn't leave, there's no slavery in Egypt, and God can't save them and bring them back.
What would have happened if Isaac?
Rabbi, you need the microphone.
She has it.
You have it?
Yeah. It's not going to amplify you. It's just for the people at home.
No?
Yeah. Well, maybe it will. Okay. Either
Well, what
way.
would have happened if Isaac left?
If Isaac left, then he couldn't have been the proto. I don't know. We would have had to. We would have had to figure something out. But God was convincing. I don't know.
He prevented that by the whole keeping him there.
Yeah. God said to him, "You can't leave," and so he said, "Okay, I'm not leaving." Yeah.
The Dome of the Rock also is sacred to the
You have the mic right there.
Oh, sorry. The Dome of the Rock is also sacred to the Muslims because it's where supposedly Muhammad left
Right.
to Mecca.
Right. Because we don't have to point out every fact that we know. I mean, right, okay. I mean, just, yes, it's true. But, Trust me, I have a lot of material. Okay, we haven't even gotten to the first one. Why is it holy to the Christians?
Why is it holy to the Christians?
Because Jesus used to teach in that area. So,
I taught in Galilee.
but he also taught on the Temple Mount. He tripped over a money table there too. So, unfortunately for us, the Muslims made this thing up about it's the worst thing that ever happened to us. So, all right, let's go on. Just tell me when you guys are ready.
We're ready.
No rush. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a long way now. The first time we ever see Sukkot really being celebrated comes at a very special time, and that is when King Solomon dedicates the first temple. So when King Solomon dedicates the first temple, the dedication comes on the holiday of Sukkot. Now, it could come anytime. It could have come on Rosh Hashanah. It could have come on Pesach. It could have come on, Simchas Torah. But there was a particular reason why he picked Sukkot. Now, what the nature of Sukkot, there are a few things that we know about it. One is that we sit in sukkahs and we dwell. The other is that we take the what's called the dalid minim, the four species, right? The willows, the myrtle, the lulav, and the etrog, the palm branch and the citron, and we take them together and we hold them together. Both of those things remind us of doing things together. We sit in the sukkah together, we take the species together, and Sukkot also has something interesting that goes along with doing something together. It's the one holiday where you offer a sacrifice for all the 70 nations. You have the Shivim Parim, the 70 cows, and on different days of Sukkot, they would bring a certain amount of cows, one for each of the other 70 nations that were praying for the whole world. Now, something very interesting. One of the jobs of the Jews is to, you know this from Isaiah, is or legoyim, to enlighten the rest of the world, right? To be a light unto the nations. You've heard that before, a light unto the nations. To do what? To teach them the nature of God. And one of the ways that we do that is we teach as we offer a sacrifice to God on behalf of the 70 nations, that they should someday understand the nature of God. Now, how do we know that there's 70 nations? Because in the genealogy in Genesis, it lists the 70 people who go out into the world. Okay. And each one of them starts one of the different nations. Now, if you remember, when Jacob came down to Egypt, how many people came with him? 70. And so each of those original Jews represents one of the 70 nations in the world, which is kind of interesting. By the way, there are a lot of other very cool things with 70. You could do a whole class on this and the gematria and the Kabbalah of the 70. But on a very simple level, there were 70 original Jews who came. The Torah mentioned this specifically. There were 70 original Jews who came with Jacob down to the land of Israel. And according to tradition, each of them corresponds to one of the 70 nations, which means to say that each one of us represents something that is supposed to be like an emissary to someone out there in the rest of the world to teach them about the true nature of God. Which means you should all join the Unbiased Initiative, because that's what we're trying to do, is go out and tell the Goyim not to hate us. So, all right, Goyim is, that's a term that may be insensitive to some people, so I changed it to the nations. Don't be so offended. All right. But the term is or legoyim. Right, goyim is goyim, but it's become over time a little pejorative, which is funny because we're the ones who are hated, not them. But all right, doesn't matter. So Solomon now on the holiday of Sukkot, and if you would look in the books of Samuel and you read through the story, you see that King Solomon did something very special to inaugurate the first holy temple on Sukkot. So the first thing we said was that when Abraham as the first Jew on a mission to go to the Temple Mount where the Holy Temple is going to be, he got there and he saw a sukkah. And he said, what's up with the sukkah? I never even heard of Sukkot. Abraham would never know about Sukkot. Sukkot is something that came about because the Jews wandered in the wilderness and God made sukkahs. He lived before they wandered in the wilderness. He never even imagined such a thing. So he saw a sukkah and he said, what's this? He thought it was the pro shop. You know, he didn't know what it was. Right, yeah, souvenirs. So, so he sees it. Okay. King Solomon knows all about the holiday of Sukkot, but he also knows about Abraham, and that the first time Abraham came, there was a sukkah there. So now he says, wow, there must be something that connects the building of the Holy Temple and this festival of Sukkot. So now that I've built the first temple, I'm going to inaugurate the temple on the festival of Sukkot. Now, here's something, obviously you can see where we're going because there's going to be a second temple. And then we're going to deal with that epoch and try to figure out what that has to do with Sukkot. But what's the difference between the inauguration of the first temple and the inauguration of the second temple and the population of the Jewish people?
70.
So this is an amazing concept. When the first temple was inaugurated, every Jew who lived in the world was in Israel. Every Jew there who there was. There were no Jews who lived outside of Israel. All the Jews were there. They all lived in Israel. Now, were there a few maybe who had business elsewhere, they're traveling, whatever? Sure. But everybody was based in Israel. There's a few in Boca, a few in Babylon, a few in Egypt, whatever. But the overwhelming majority, the Jews, they lived in Israel. And there was no idea that they would ever leave until the Babylonians came and they got kicked out. Okay, so King Solomon, King David founds the city of Jerusalem in the year 1000 BCE. Okay? He rules for 40 years. In 960, King Solomon becomes the king. And that's roughly the time that the first temple is built. Okay, he rules until 920. And so for several hundred years, from 920 till Solomon dies and the kingdom splits, until 586, the Jews are in Israel. And when they inaugurate the first temple, they're all there, and they all come. Now, has anyone ever heard of the mitzvah called Hakhel? Hakhel. Comes from the same Hebrew root as the word Kehillah. Lahakhel. Hakhel means to Kehillah, right? To come together. So the mitzvah is that once every 7 years, every Jew has to come on Sukkot, in ancient times when there was a temple, to the holy temple, and they would read the king would read the whole Torah. Now, why would you do that every 7 years? Don't you know that every year on Sukkot everyone has to come anyway? It's a pilgrimage holiday. Well, no, the truth is not everyone had to come. Who didn't have to come? Women, children, disabled. You had an excuse, you had a note from your rabbi, you consulted your local Chabad rabbi, maybe you could get out of it, right? They didn't accept letters from Reform back then. So, I mean, they accepted it in the, in the Knesset, but not in the Ministry of Interior, and not in the Labor Party accepted it, but Shas didn't. Okay. I could do a lot of this. Exactly. In Israel, this would have been a lot funnier. Okay.
It's not funny there.
No, it's fun. Oh, okay. It depends how you look at it. All right. So, the difference between Hakhel every 7 years and the pilgrimage of every single year is that on certain years, except for Hakhel, there are people who had excuse they didn't have to go. Hakhel, everyone had to go. Now, if you're too sick to go, fine. But everyone was supposed to go. And they would read the whole Torah. What King Solomon was doing by having the opening of the temple, the dedication of the temple on Sukkot, was he was recreating that mitzvah. The mitzvah of all the Jewish people being in Israel, hearing the entire Torah read by the king. And in addition to that, he's also incorporating two other things. One is, this is the time of year where we pray for the whole world. Right? This is when we bring sacrifices on behalf of all of the 70 nations. And I know that Sukkot is something that has to do with the Temple Mount because Abraham saw a sukkah. That's what we have so far. Now, what was the difference then between the first temple period, when they inaugurated the first temple. So let's fast forward. 920, King Solomon dies, the first temple is built, everyone has a temple. Fast forward to 586 BCE, the Babylonians come in, and they bring the Jews, they burn the first temple, they bring the Jews to slaves as Babylonia. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed, I mean, we don't know how many. And most of them go as slaves to Babylonia. They're there for 70 years, and then the Purim story happens. The Purim story happens, and the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And the Persians say, we like the Jews. In fact, we love the Jews. Why? Because their queen was Jewish. Her name was Esther. And Esther married Ahasuerus. And they had a son, and his name was Darius. And Darius became king when he was 7 years old. And Darius said to the Jews, I'm Jewish, because my mom Esther's Jewish. You can go home. Now, you may have heard the story a different way, which is that King Cyrus was the one who told the Jews they could go back. King Cyrus was the one who told the Jews he could go back, not necessarily because he loved the Jews so much, but because he believed that if you let people worship their own God, they would pay their taxes. And so he let the Babylonians go, after he conquered the Babylonians, he let them build their Babylonian churches or temples or whatever, and they worshiped their gods, and they were happy, so they paid their taxes. And he said to the Jews, you can go back. And they went back, some of them. And they went back and started building the temple. Now, who was the leader who went back with them to start building the temple? Ezra. And Ezra took 41,000 people back with him. But when they got back to start building the temple, what they found was there were other people who lived there. And the other people who lived there were not good, except for one of them. Those were the Samaritans. There was one who was good. The rest of them were horrible. And they hated the Jews because they wanted the Temple Mount for themselves and for their holy stuff. And so they sent an ambassador to Persia to lobby for the Temple Mount should be for them. And so the Jews also sent an ambassador. And the two ambassadors met on the side of the road. And one of them had provisions. You know, when you're schlepping, there's only one road. When you're schlepping from Israel to Persia, you got to bring a lot of provisions with you. But one of them had eaten through and drank all his water and eaten through all his provisions and nothing left. The other one had plenty left. He was doing a better job rationing. So he said, give me some of what you have, otherwise I'm going to die out here. So the one ambassador said, I'm happy to. Here you go, but on one condition, that you agree to be my slave forever, and you've got to tattoo it on you that I own you. Who are these two people? The Samaritans' representative was a guy named Haman, and the Jewish representative was a guy named Mordecai. And these are the two people who met. And so they both went up, and they lobbied in front of Ahasuerus and so forth. But Haman was very wealthy, and he did better because he had a lot of money. He had so much money, I don't know why he just couldn't buy some. I guess there's, all the money in the world. If there's nowhere to buy food, there's not much you can do with it. So later on in the story, the Midrash tells us that, when Haman saw Mordecai and he said, bow down to me, and Mordecai said, well, why would I bow down to you? And he said, you're not going to bow down to me? Then I'm going to kill all the Jews. But Mordecai said to him, why would I bow down to you? I own you. You're my servant. I'm going to bow down to you. And then you know what happens. But this is what was going on in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, you had Ezra and his people, and you had the Samaritans, and they're fighting over the Temple Mount. Now, ultimately, what the miracle happens in Esther and Ahasuerus and so forth. But Ahasuerus hated the Jews as much as Haman. And what Ahasuerus said was, I know my father Cyrus said the Jews can go back, but I'm revoking it. And he revoked it. And when something's revoked, the rule was you weren't allowed to put it back into place until the king who revoked it, he couldn't be back in place until that king died. So the Jews couldn't go back till Ahasuerus died. But 7 years after he marries Esther, he dies. And they had a son, Darius. Darius became king at 7 years old because that's when Ahasuerus died. And Darius reinstituted the Edict of Cyrus. and the rest of the Jews could then go back to the second temple. But in the meantime, there were already some Jews who were there. Who was there? Ezra and the 40,000 some Jews who went with him. Now, what were Ezra and the 41,000 Jews doing? They were starting to rebuild the temple. So here's what happens. And this is what's different between the dedication of the second temple and the dedication of the first temple. The dedication of the second temple was dedicated when most of the Jews in the world didn't live there. That's incredible. By the way, that's also what happened in 1948. We declared the state of Israel. Yeah, but most of us were in Baltimore, in Rochester, and Wilkes-Barre, and so forth. Okay, so now the second temple is going to be dedicated by Ezra. Who's Ezra's teammate? Nehemiah. When do you think, if they had to pick a holiday, when do you think they rededicated the second temple? What a guess. All right, so now let's take a look at it. If you look at Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 13 to 18, what you're going to see here is, and you'll also see Ezra down below. There are two books, by the way, there are two books in the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're the same book. They're split up into the names of two, but they're a continuation. It's the same, it's essentially the same book. Continued, the same time period, the same prophets speaking at the same time, living at the same time together. But let's take a look at what, now you might think that, Sukkot celebrations happen all the time in the Bible. These are the only ones. The ones I'm telling you about are the only ones. So I'm saying is, if you wanted to look at Sukkot, why not look at the times where Sukkot is mentioned in the Bible? When's the first time it's mentioned? When Solomon dedicates the first temple. When's the second time it's mentioned? When Ezra and Nehemiah dedicate the second temple. So if you look at that, then you start to say, wow, Sukkot's pretty interesting. If we look at what's going on, we see that Sukkot has something to do with the Holy Temple. And then we could try to learn about the essence of what this holiday is all about. So that's, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do right now. Clear so far? Yeah? Okay. All right, Norman, will you? I'll give you this mic. It's on. Okay, so we're looking at the first source, Nehemiah chapter 8.
And on the second day, all of the nation's heads of clans, the Kohanim and the Leviim, gathered to Ezra the Sofer and to gain insight into the words of the Torah. And they found recorded in the Torah, which God commanded via Moshe, that Israel should sit in Sukkot on the holiday in the 7th month, and that they should announce and transmit a message through all of their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, "Go out to the mountain and bring olive branches and branches of oil wood and myrtle branches and date branches and branches of the braided tree and make Sukkot as recorded." And the nation went out and bought, and they made Sukkot for themselves, each on his roof and in their yards and in the yards of the house of God and in the plaza by the water gate and in the plaza by the Ephraim gate. And the entire community who had returned from captivity made Sukkot, and they dwelled in Sukkot. For Israel had not done thus since the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, and there was very great joy. And he read from the book of the Torah of God each day, from the first day to the last day. And they made a 7-day celebration and a festival on the 8th day as per the law.
Okay. Now, there's one line in here that the Gemara, the Talmud, is just stunned by. I mean, just they could not believe. What could it possibly be? Exactly. Very good. Look what it says here. Where is it? Oh, okay. 3 lines from the bottom. The end of the 4th line from the bottom. And the entire community who had returned from captivity made Sukkot, and they dwelled in Sukkos. For Israel had not done thus since the days of Yoshua ben Nun until that day, and there was great joy. Which means to say that they hadn't celebrated Sukkot in about 1,000 years. So that's obviously not believable. I mean, are we really to believe that King Solomon and King David never observed Sukkot all their lives? And all the other, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, that those guys never observed Sukkot? Okay, so the Gemara is shocked by this language, and we're trying to figure out what exactly it means. Now, let's look here, because there's some clues, that in this time now of the second Holy Temple is about to be consecrated, there's a connection between Sukkot and the Temple Mount and the second temple. Just like there was with the first temple, just like there was when Abraham got to the region, to the area. Now, look what they did. So the nation went out. First of all, they went and they collected all the stuff they needed for the 4 species, right? The lulav, etrog, myrtle, and hadass. Myrtle and willow. And then they made sukkot. Look what this, they made sukkot for themselves, each on his roof and in their yards. Okay, so everyone had their own sukkah. Fine. They did it on their roof, they did it in their backyard, whatever. But then it also says, and they did it in the yards of the house of God, which means to say that up on the Temple Mount, they also built sukkot in and around the Holy Temple. And then they did it in public. How do I know they did it in public? Because they did it by the gates. The gates were where people would hang out. The water gate especially, because that's where everyone went to get their water from the Siloam stream, whatever we call it. The spring, the Gihon spring. One of the great things about the Gihon spring, as it's mentioned in the Torah, is that the water company in Israel today is called Gihon. That's one of the things you love about being in Israel. Okay. So there were sukkahs everywhere, not just in your backyard, not just at the shul, but there were sukkahs everywhere. And then, once the Tanakh tells us that there are sukkahs everywhere, and the entire community who had returned from captivity, meaning these 40,000 Jews, they dwelt in sukkahs, for Israel had not done so since the days of Joshua, and there was great joy. So what the Talmud says about that is, of course, Jews have been celebrating Sukkot all of these years. We're not going to say no Jew has celebrated Sukkah, or no community of Jews have celebrated Sukkot for the last 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a long time. What we're saying is that nobody had done it this way, not just in their backyards, but in public. Now, why specifically would they want to do it in public and up on the Temple Mount? Think about what God was saying when God built his sukkah in the area. He was praying for Geula. Geula meaning all the Jews coming here and building the temple. When was the last time that all the Jews were in Israel together? And they were actually together? With Joshua. When Joshua brought them all in before they started going their separate ways. And Joshua had a walled, Okay, so the difference between the way that they celebrated Sukkot at the second temple with Ezra and Nehemiah compared to what happened when Solomon was doing it. When Solomon was inaugurating the first temple, we didn't see this. They built sukkahs here, they built sukkahs there, they built sukkahs in public, they built sukkahs at the gates, they built sukkahs on the Temple Mount. No, everyone had their own sukkah and that was it. Because everyone was already there in Jerusalem. This is Geula. This is the redemption. This is the Messianic era. But now we know what it's like to be kicked out. For some of us to come back while the rest of us are still up there in captivity or wherever, or in the diaspora. Abraham saw the sukkah that God built as a sign that someday all the Jews would come here. And they did in the time of Solomon, but then they left. So now what these Jews are doing in the time of the Second Temple period is they're recreating not what Solomon did, but what God did. We're building a sukkah on the Temple Mount for all the Jews who aren't here. in the hopes that someday they will all come here and we'll have redemption. So the first temple was about, we've achieved redemption. The second temple is we lost it, we're trying to get it back. See the difference? Either way, in the Bible, there's no Sukkot without a connection to the Holy Temple. Okay. Clear so far? Okay, so let's look now at the second source, Ezra. Edith, would you, chapter 3, verse 1 of Ezra.
And the seventh month arrived, and Israel were in their cities, and the nation gathered as one to Jerusalem. And Yehoshua ben Jehozadak and his brethren Kohanim and Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel and his brethren, and they built an altar for the God of Israel, upon which to elevate burnt offerings, as recorded in the Torah of Moshe, the man of God. And they prepared the altar on its foundations, for they were afraid of the nations of the lands, and they brought burnt offerings upon it in the morning and evening. And they performed the holiday of Sukkot as recorded, and each day's burnt offering on its day according to the number as per the law, each day its due. And then the daily burnt offering, and for the months and for all of the festivals of God, which had been consecrated, and for all who volunteered an offering to God.
Okay, so first thing is, what you see here is that this is the inauguration of the second temple, and it's being done on Sukkot. Now, the leader here is this priest named Joshua, the son of Yehozadak. But then there's this other guy, Zerubbabel, ben Shealtiel. So if you look on the second page, the Talmud tells us who's Zerubbabel. You see Bavli Sanhedrin 38a? He was named Shealtiel, for God repealed his vow that Jechoniah would have no child. He was a different king. Zerubbabel, for he was conceived in Babylon. And who's that? Zerubbabel was his Babylonian name, but his Hebrew name was Nehemiah, Nehemiah, son of Chakaliah is his name. So Zerubbabel that's mentioned in Ezra chapter 3 is Nehemiah, according to the rabbis in the Talmud. This is Nehemiah. And the story that's being told here in chapter 3 is the same story that's being told here in Nehemiah. There was only one inauguration of the second temple. These aren't two different stories. However, they're described in different ways. So if we look at the first story of Nehemiah, it was all about out in the community what's happening. We're building, yes, we built sukkahs on the Temple Mount, but we also built sukkahs at the Ephraim Gate and at the Water Gate and in your backyard and on his roof, and everyone, there's sukkahs everywhere, and it's all over the community. And we all have our lulavs and we all have our etrogs, and everybody went and schlepped them and so forth. That's the first source. This is happening all out in the community. The second source, Ezra 3, chapter 3, is focused only on what's going on in the Holy Temple, which means to say one thing, the sacrifices. They're talking about the sacrifices. Okay? So there's two aspects of Sukkot. One aspect is what's going on in the Holy Temple, the sacrifices. And the other aspect is what's going on out and about in the community. Now, in the first temple, we don't have any of these stories about everyone's building sukkahs in their backyards. We only have what's going on in the Holy Temple, and it's Hakel. Everybody comes together to the Temple Mount. The second story, we have what's going on in everyone's backyards too. Right? And that means to say that in the first story, all the Jews were there together, and in the second story, they weren't, and so they were doing things to symbolize that they wanted the rest of the Jews to come back from the diaspora. Okay? Now, let's see what this other stuff we've already talked about. Okay. Someone have the mic? All right, these other sources I've already explained.
My question is, when did our home become, in our literature, our holy temple?
What do you mean?
Well, we consider our home our temple. Am I off base on that?
No, so-
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so look, you have, it used to be, when the time that the Holy Temple stood, there were no synagogues. There was no prayer. If you wanted to worship God, you had to go to the Holy Temple and offer a sacrifice. I wrote my thesis on this, the transition from temple and sacrifice to synagogue and prayer in Second Temple rabbinic literature, Second Temple period. That was my thesis. About 3 people in the world have read it. Me, my professor, and my dad. Maybe my uncle read part of it. So, but after that happens, after the temple is destroyed, and you can worship God in other places, besides offering a sacrifice on the temple mat, and you have communal prayer, and you have mitzvahs at home, that's the transition. But the transition is the destruction of the first temple, and then the temple is called the Beit HaMikdash. But after that, we have a new term called Mikdash Me'at, which means little temples, meaning whether it's your home or your... Now, does that mean to say there were no mitzvahs that were done in the home? No. For example, the Passover Seder. It wasn't called the Seder, but you would take your meat from the Holy Temple and bring it to your home. It was actually called a chabura, and you would eat your meat in your home. There were mitzvahs that were done in the home, mezuzah, whatever. But the change of synagogue and other locations becoming holy came when the temple was destroyed. Yeah, Eric? Either one. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to mention, this second temple was dedicated at the time of Sukkot, the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah, and this was almost like a sukkah because it was like a low-budget operation because King Horus haven't really built a big second temple. So this was just kind of like the beginning of it, so more like a sukkah.
Yeah, in fact, the second temple wasn't much for another 500 years until Herod came. And he's the one Herod's the one who built it and, really built it up. And it didn't last very long because it was destroyed 70 years later. But, it was much smaller than the first temple.
I have a question. When you started the class, you were talking about this temporal meaning of the sukkah. And it sounds counterintuitive that the temple and the dedication of the temple, which supposedly was majestic and not temporal, but rather supposedly when done, arguably permanent, it's associated or has some sort of relationship with Sukkot, which is something temporal and fragile and so forth. So is that in some way an indication that wasn't going to be permanent?
That the temple wasn't going to be permanent?
Because I'm troubled that something that is
Yeah.
so fragile and that it's telling you
Yeah, beautiful.
you have as a kehila to gather in a fragile place. So is that telling us this is not going to be permanent and you will feel vulnerable and you will feel very fragile and yet you need to be in a kehila and you need to sit together.
Ah, beautiful. Well, pessimistic, but beautiful.
I'm just, it's like yin yang otherwise. Like why something?
Yeah. Well, listen. So the second temple. I agree with you with regard to the second temple, but not the third temple. We're still waiting for the third temple. But if you look at the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has the plans on how to build the temple. So Ezekiel lived after the first temple was destroyed, and he explains, okay, when you build the second temple, Ezekiel explains when you build the next temple, here's how to build it. Exact specifications. So when they went to build the second temple, they didn't build it according to Ezekiel's specifications, even though they recognized Ezekiel as a prophet. So why? Because Ezekiel's temple was built to be the last temple. And the people who were building the second temple knew that that wasn't the last one. Ezra and Nehemiah as prophets, and it must have been painful for them to build it knowing that someday it's probably going to be destroyed too. But when we build the third one, it's going to be awesome. Then we're not going to have to worry. By the way, we're not going to build the third one. It's just going to come from the heavens. God's just going to bring it down. It's going to smash that blue thing that's there now, and we'll be good to go. But we'll worry about that when God brings it. All right. The third. Okay, so we looked at 2. I said there were 3. We looked at 2. The third one's going to shock you in one way and make sense to you in a different way. The first time that we see Sukkot, or the ideas of Sukkot in the Tanakh, come when King Solomon inaugurates the first temple on Sukkot. The second time we see it is when we just saw it, when Ezra and Nehemiah come and dedicate the second temple on Sukkot. And the other time that we saw it, at least midrashically, was when Abraham saw a vision of a sukkah when he went to take Isaac. Now, by the way, the Midrash talks about this a lot. I'm going to talk about it in a way that I think is really fascinating during the service today when I give a Devar Torah. But when you think about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you think of, or Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. Well, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. 4 matriarchs, 4 patriarchs. And then you have the 4 species. Is that each one of the species goes with one of the 4. And when you start looking at how, it becomes really fascinating, especially when you're dealing with Isaac, because it has a lot to do with the Holy Temple. But that's for the service later on. The third time, the Holy Temple is dedicated 3 times. What are the 3 times? We've already covered 2. The first time the Holy Temple is inaugurated is with Solomon. The second time the Holy Temple is inaugurated is with Ezra and Nehemiah. The third time the Holy Temple is dedicated is the Maccabees. It was rededicated. Chanukah means rededication. Well, they had to clean it out and re-inaugurate it. Now, you might say, yeah, but Hanukkah was in Kislev. What does Hanukkah have to do with Sukkot? Well, how long is Sukkot? 8 days. How long is Hanukkah? The rabbis tell us in the Gemara, but it's also in the book of Maccabees, which is not part of our canon, but it's still considered interesting, that during the year of the war, they weren't able to celebrate Sukkot because they couldn't there was no Holy Temple. The Holy Temple wasn't in their hands. They couldn't offer the sacrifices, so there was no Sukkot. So the first thing they did when they went to rededicate the temple was they did a delayed Sukkot, which is a lot of, now, the idea of the candles burning for 8 days, okay, maybe that happened too, although that's a much later idea. I still believe it. What it says in the Gemara is, you know how long it took to get to the place where they made the oil? 4 days by camel. There's a city called Tekoa, not in Georgia, the one in Middle Israel. So you go to Tekoa, that's where you could get the fresh oil. So a 4 days journey to go get the oil on camel and 4 days back, that's 8 days. So they needed the little oil that they had to burn for 8 days until they could get a fresh supply of oil coming every day to the Holy Temple. If Tekoa was one more camel's day journey away, 5 days away, then kids would get 10 presents. But because it was 4, if it was, thank God it wasn't 3, you'd only get 6, but okay. So 8 it worked out, and that's one of the rationales for why the candles needed to burn for 8 days. But the other rationale is, and an earlier rationale is, that they didn't get to do Sukkot this year. And so when the Maccabees rededicate the temple, and they didn't get to do Sukkot, and they're going to rededicate the temple, they said to themselves, what's more appropriate to do right now than anything else, based on what we know is supposed to happen when you rededicate a temple. When you rededicate the temple, is that you observe the festival of Sukkot. So now what we see is, if you understand that, I'm not making that up. You can go look in the Gemara, look in the book of Maccabees. But if you look at the 3 times that we see Sukkot mentioned in the Tanakh and in the Gemara. By the way, if you look in the Talmud, there's a whole tractate for Sukkot. There's a whole tractate for Rosh Hashanah. There's a whole tractate for Purim, for Rosh Hashanah. There's nothing for Hanukkah. Hanukkah is hardly mentioned at all. But when it is mentioned, it's mentioned in connection with Sukkot. So if you look at the only times that Sukkot are mentioned biblically, after, the original, here's the Torah, here's what Sukkot is, which we'll read in the Torah, Leviticus 23. But if you look at all the other times that it's mentioned in the Tanakh, it has to do with the rededication of the first temple, or the inauguration of the first temple, the inauguration of the second temple, and the rededication of the third temple. That's what we've seen so far. So if we're going to now summarize everything that we've done, we have to ask the question, what's the big deal? Why does Sukkot, what is the connection between Sukkot and the holy temple? And the answer, I think, is this, is that on Yom Kippur, we live like angels. Right? We dress in white, we don't eat, we don't drink, and we try to have this day where we're praying all day long like the angels do, and then we're living in a different world. We're living in what you might call Olam Haba, the next world. We're living in heaven with God for a day. And that's what it's supposed to be, a day of complete holiness. But that's only one day, and you can't stay there forever as long as you're alive. When you die, you can go there forever, but when you're still alive, you can't stay there forever, so then you have to come back into the world. So 5 days later, you bring that holiness that you took from Yom Kippur into the sukkah. And you sit in the sukkah. And the sukkah is a holy place. The sukkah is a halachically holy place. Right? The halacha with the sukkah, it's just like the schach that you put on top. It's just, like bamboo or something, but it's holy. And you can't use it for anything afterwards. It takes on a halachic, different than like shofar or yarmulke or tzitzit. It becomes holier, even though it's just, dead, branches. So the sukkah becomes this very holy place. We invite holy guests into it, right? The Ushpizin are supposed to come and visit. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon, Moses, they all come and Aaron, they all come and visit us. So we invite God's presence into there. There's something holy about it. There's something special about it. But also, it's a mitzvah to do not holy things there. It's a mitzvah to dwell in a sukkah. It's a mitzvah to sleep in a sukkah. It's a mitzvah to eat in a sukkah. It's a mitzvah to do your daily work in the sukkah. If you have work to do, you're working on a spreadsheet or something, and you could either do it in your house or go do it in the sukkah. It's a mitzvah to go be in the sukkah and do it. So what we're saying is we're taking that holiness, that experience of being in heaven for one day on Yom Kippur, and we're throwing that into the sukkah, which means we're trying to infuse our daily lives with what we got on Yom Kippur. We're trying to bring a little bit of Yom Kippur into our daily lives. But when you think about the mitzvahs of the sukkah is for everyone to be together. And the idea of the lulav and the etrog is that you hold them together and they're bound. So when you're holding the lulav and the etrog and you're sitting in the sukkah, what are you holding? So let me say this one more time. When you go into the sukkah and you're holding the lulav and the etrog, that represents something that you're holding in a place that you are. Now, let me just put that into context. The first holy temple was inaugurated in a communal way because all the Jews were there. The second temple was it was communal, but it was also individual and personal because there were all these Jews who weren't there, and so we're building spaces for them too. And then the third one is saying, we're rededicating the temple, we're all coming back to the temple, and we're all here. And so the whole point of Sukkot, after the personal experience of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the whole point of Sukkot and the Holy Temple is unity of the Jewish people. It's achdut. When you're holding the species together, they're bound together. You have to hold it together. It has to be bound. You can't have the Holy Temple. There's no point to the Holy Temple without the unity of the Jewish people. If we're all there, or we're yearning for all of us to be there. That's the difference between the first temple and the second temple. Either we're all there, or we're yearning for all of us to be there. And why did God build a sukkah there? Because he was yearning for the day when all his people were going to be there. When my house is built there and all the Jews are there. And when you're sitting in the sukkah, everyone's meant to come together. And when you're holding the four species, it's meant to be that we should all be bound together. So the essence of all of this, of everything that we've done today, is that the connection between Sukkot and the Temple Mount is the place where we're all unified, where all of our prayers go in order to go up into heaven. That's the place where we're all together. And Sukkot is the holiday that reminds us that even though you had Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as this individual experience, potentially, you now have to come back and be together with the community, because if you don't come together and be back to the community, then really you don't have anything, and what you did on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur doesn't matter. And so when we go and have our meals in the sukkah, if we're not together, if we're not sitting under the shade of God's presence, then we really have nothing. And one last idea is that what Abraham said was, I want to call this place Yira'eh, because this is the place where you see God and you experience God. But the one other place outside of the land of Israel where you can sit in the shade of God, it's called a sukkah. And the Gemara talks about a concept called sel dehemanuta, the shade of God's presence. So the one place where you know that you can create outside of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem a place where God's presence actually shows up is when you're sitting in the sukkah. So our sukkah out here is meant to remind us that all of us are sitting together on the Temple Mount every time sukkah comes around. Okay. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom.
I like that very much. It's great.
that?
You're addicted to this? One of my friend. מה?
אנשים שולחים לי הערות על הכיתה, שהם צופים בלייב סטרים.
יפה.
יש להם תמיד הערות על הכיתה.
אני הייתי תלמידה מאוד טובה. בישראל, כן.
תודה. חג שמח.
גם לך.
Kahal, but anything to do with Kohelet.
Good question.
Isn't this the year of Hakel?
I think so, yeah. People are talking about it a lot, so it must be.
My teacher this semester, Robin Walsh, you probably have not come across her, but she's an up and rising star. Her recent book, which I'm just starting, and I may pass on to you, is they say it's the best account of the gospel in 100 years.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
And she's talking about this transition and it becomes important to Judaism because she's saying that the Christians adopted the Platonism, the philo ideas. Judaism couldn't do it, but Christianity did. Maimonides didn't carry it off. Maimonides didn't succeed. That's a false description of Maimonides. He tried, but he could not. He could not.
He was, they call him a Neoplatonic.
He tried. He tried. So did Philo. But it wasn't until Christianity that these ideas were fully synthesized into a new religion.
Okay.
So I'm going to follow that through. If the book moves in that direction, I'll give it to you.
Okay, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you for Tuesday. You did a beautiful job on Bernie's funeral.
Oh, thank you.
I really